In D.C., that figure has now surpassed 90%. These men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste. A group of people defined largely by race, relegated to a permanent second-class status by law. Now, I'm fairly certain that there's at least one person out there who's thinking, what is she talking about? Our criminal justice system isn't a system of racial control, it's a system of crime control. And if black folks would just stop running around committing so many crimes, they wouldn't have to worry about being locked up and then stripped of their basic civil and human rights. But therein lies the greatest myth about mass incarceration, namely that it's been driven by crime and crime rates. It's not true. It's not true. Over the last 30 years, our prison population has exploded, has quintupled. We've gone from a rate of incarceration, we've gone from about 300,000 people behind bars in the mid-1970s to over 2 million today. We now, as a nation, have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of highly repressive regimes like Russia or China and Iran. But again, this explosion in imprisonment is not due to crime rates. Over the past few decades, crime rates have fluctuated, have gone up, have gone down. Today, as bad as crime rates are in many parts of the country, crime rates are actually at historical lows. But incarceration rates have soared. Most criminologists and sociologists today will acknowledge that crime rates and incarceration rates in the United States have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates, especially black incarceration rates, have soared regardless of whether crime was going up or down in any given community or the nation as a whole. Now, people often tell me, well, shouldn't we focus on the front end, on keeping kids in schools and fixing our schools so they don't wind up in prison? And my answer is yes, yes. We absolutely must fix our schools and give each child a quality education so they have an opportunity to compete in this new global economy. And if we want to bring down violent crime rates, there's absolutely nothing more important than education and job creation. William Julius Wilson's book, When Work Disappears, he cites data showing that if you control for joblessness, in other words, if you compare white jobless men with black jobless men, the racial disparities in violent crime disappear. Now, joblessness is not an excuse for violence by any means. But if we want to reduce violent crime in our communities, the best remedy is education and job creation. But reducing crime rates, simply reducing crime rates, will not end mass incarceration. Let me repeat that. Simply reducing crime rates will not end mass incarceration. Why? Because crime rates have not been driving the explosion of our prison system. So what has? If not crime and crime rates? Well, it turns out that the activists who post that sign on the telephone pole were right. The war on drugs and the Get Tough movement, the wave of punitiveness that washed over the United States. What has changed dramatically is not so much crime, but what gets defined as crime and how we respond to it. And nothing has contributed more to this harsh response than the war on drugs. Drug convictions alone, just drug convictions, accounted for 2/3 of the increase in the federal prison system and more than half of the increase in the state prison system between 1985 and 2000, the period of our prison system's most dramatic expansion. Drug convictions have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. To get a sense of how large a contribution the war on drugs has made to mass incarceration, consider this. There are more people in prisons and jails today just for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. Now, most Americans violate drug laws in their lifetime. Most do. That's what the research shows. But the drug war, not by accident, has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, even though studies have consistently shown now for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites, or sell. Now, that defies our basic racial stereotypes about who's a drug dealer. Now, if you picture a drug dealer in your mind, you're probably picturing some black kid standing on the street corner with his pants sagging. Plenty of drug dealing happens in the hood, but it happens everywhere else in America as well. A white kid living in rural Kansas doesn't drive to the hood to get his marijuana or his meth or his cocaine. No, he gets it most likely from someone of his own race down the road. In fact, where significant differences in the survey data appear, it frequently suggests that white youth are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than black youth. But that's not what you would guess by taking a peek inside our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders. In some states, 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison have been one race, African American. Now, I find that many people, when they see the data, they're stunned, and they say, yeah, that's awful. Those racial disparities, it's astounding. But still, we need to be waging a drug war in those ghetto communities, because that's where the violent offenders can be found. That's where the drug kingpins can be found. They say it makes sense to wage the drug war in the ghetto communities because we have to get tough with them. That's where the violence is. Indeed, in my experience, most people seem to imagine that the war on drugs was declared in response to the emergence of crack cocaine and the related violence. And for a while, I believed that too. But it's not true. It's not the case. President Ronald Reagan declared the current drug war in 1982 at a time when drug crime was on the decline, not on the rise. He declared the drug war before, not after, crack became a media sensation and was ravaging inner city communities. President Richard Nixon was the first to coin the term, a war on drugs, but it was President Ronald Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. And at the time he declared his drug war, drug crime was actually on the decline, and less than 3% of the American population identified drugs as the nation's most pressing concern. So why declare a drug war at a time when drug crime is declining and the American population isn't much concerned about drugs? Well, the answer is that from the outset, the drug war had relatively little to do with genuine concern about drug addiction or drug abuse, and nearly everything to do with politics, racial politics. Numerous historians and political scientists have now documented that the war on drugs was part of a grand Republican Party strategy known as the Southern Strategy of using racially coded, get-tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working-class whites in the South who were resentful of, fearful of, anxious about many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. Now, to be fair, I think we have to acknowledge that poor and working-class whites really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. You know, wealthy whites, they could send their kids to private schools, give their kids all of the advantages that wealth has to offer. But poor and working class whites were faced with a social demotion. It was their kids who might be bused across town to go to a school they believed was inferior. It was their kids and themselves who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms for limited jobs with this whole new group of people they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. And then to make matters worse from their perspective, affirmative action programs created the perception that black folks were now leapfrogging over them on their way to Harvard and Yale and fancy jobs in corporate America. And this state of affairs created an enormous amount of fear, resentment, anger, but it also created an enormous political opportunity. Pollsters and political strategists found that thinly veiled promises to get tough on them, a group of people not so suddenly defined by race, could be enormously successful in persuading poor and working class whites to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. In fact, in the words of H.R. Haldeman, President Richard Nixon's former chief of staff, he explained the strategy this way, quote, "The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote. Well, they did. A couple years after the drug war was announced, crack cocaine began to ravage inner city communities. And the Reagan administration seized on this development with glee, actually hiring staff whose job it was to feed to the media stories of inner city crack babies and crack deals and the so-called crack whores and crack-related violence. Their goal was to make crack a media sensation in the hopes that it would bolster public support for a drug war they had already declared and persuade Congress to devote millions more dollars to waging it. And the plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, our television sets were saturated with images of crack babies, crack dealers, the so-called crack whores. And a wave of punitiveness swept over the United States, and soon Congress was passing harsh mandatory minimums for possession of small amounts of crack cocaine and other drugs, sentences harsher than murderers receive in some other Western democracies. And soon, Democrats began competing with Republicans to prove they could be even tougher on them than their Republican counterparts. And so it was President Bill Clinton who escalated the drug war far beyond what his Republican predecessors even dreamed possible. And it was President Clinton that championed laws denying federal financial aid to drug offenders for college. It was President Clinton who championed laws banning people with criminal convictions from access to public housing so that people wouldn't have housing upon release from prison. It was the Clinton administration that championed laws denying even food stamps under federal law to people who were once caught with drugs. To a large extent, the basic architecture of this new caste system was championed by a Democratic administration desperate to win back the so-called white swing voters, the folks who had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the civil rights movement. Still, in my experience, many people who are familiar with this history defend the drug war and mass incarceration nonetheless. They say, but what about all those drug kingpins, and what about the violence in our communities? Don't we need this war to deal with them? And it is true. We need an aggressive approach to dealing with the violence that plagues our communities. But let's be clear, this drug war has never been aimed at rooting out the drug kingpins or the most violent offenders. Never has. Never has. Federal funding in this war has flowed to those state and local law enforcement agencies that boost the sheer volume of drug arrests. It's been a numbers game. State and local law enforcement agencies are rewarded in cash by the millions for the sheer numbers of people swept into the system for drug offenses. This helps to explain why law enforcement so often goes out looking for the so-called low-hanging fruit, stopping, frisking, searching as many people as possible, pulling as many vehicles as possible over in a search for drugs. But of course, they don't do that so much in middle-class white neighborhoods. They don't sweep college campuses and universities for drugs, though plenty can be found there, I can assure you. No. These tactics are applied only in poor communities of color, because that's where they can get away with it and still get paid. And the results are predictable. People of color have been rounded up in mass for relatively minor, nonviolent drug offenses. In 2005, for example, 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for simple possession, only 1 out of 5 for sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses have no history of violence or significant selling activity. And in fact, in the 1990s, the Clinton years, the period of the greatest escalation of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession, a drug has now been shown to be less harmful, less addictive than alcohol or tobacco, and at least, if not more prevalent, in middle-class white communities and on college campuses as it is in the hood. But by waging the drug war exclusively in the hood, we've managed to create a vast new racial undercast in an astonishingly short period of time. Millions of people are now saddled with criminal records and legally denied the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement. Now, where has the U.S. Supreme Court been in all of this? Well, the truth is, the U.S. Supreme Court has facilitated the rise of mass incarceration. After the drug war was declared, the Supreme Court eviscerated Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. You know, once upon a time, it wasn't legal for the police to just roll up on anybody on the street, stop, interrogate them, frisk them. No, that was considered an unreasonable search and seizure, the very kind of police activity the framers meant to prohibit. But after the drug war was declared, in a series of decisions, the U.S. Supreme Court eviscerated those protections and ruled that as long as the police have consent, they can stop, frisk, search just about anybody, anywhere. Now, what's consent? Consent is when a police officer walks up to a young kid on the street and the officer's got a hand on his gun and says, "Son, put your hands up in the air so I can frisk you and see if you got anything on you." Kid goes, That's consent. All of the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures no longer applies to that encounter. Now, the Supreme Court knows that very few people dare to refuse consent when a police officer says, "May I search you? May I speak with you for a moment?" But even when someone does refuse consent, it'll be their word against the police officers in a court of law. And who is the judge more likely to believe? In this way, the U.S. Supreme Court has granted the police license